ladies and gents, thanks ever so much for joining us this afternoon for this hopefully very informative webinar, which will be mostly led by my colleague Konna, who you can see. Just to remind you that you'll be able to and share with colleagues the recording of this video on our website, giftedphilanthropy.com, certainly from the start of next week. There is already the summary report on our website, which you can visit and download. And if we'll have time for questions at the end, hopefully around 15-20 minutes, what I would ask you to do, if you've got a question, please stick it in the chat box. I will monitor them. And then when we come to the end, I'll ask a certain number of questions, however many time allows, so that Konna, or indeed I, can answer. But I'm going to hand over to Konna now. He's done all of the work on this. And I think I, like all of you, very much look forward to hearing what he's got to tell us.
Great. Thanks so much, Chris. So yeah, just again, by way of an introduction, I'm Konna Beeson, a senior consultant here at Gifted Philanthropy. And as I just said at the beginning, this is I'm a massive data nerd, and we did this sort of insights report just over a year ago when I realized that I was desperately looking for all of this sort of information, and it doesn't exist as far as I could see, especially not in recent years. So I went out to get it myself, and it was so successful that we wanted to do it again and ask a lot more questions this time. So it's hopefully it's about 50 minutes and a bit of an agenda for you all here, so you know what you're going to get. I just want to start, first of all, a massive thank you to the just over 155 fundraisers that took part in the survey, which is a massive sample size for this kind of survey, because it was very involved, very difficult to get that sort of sample size. I want to thank everyone so much for doing that, especially others that have really helped promote it and share it, like Nikki over at Fundraising Everywhere, and Caroline Danks as well, for example, over at Larkow, who's going to be using some of the data in this as part of her new benchmarking as well, which is great, which should be out soon. So as a bit of an overview here, this is going to be very sort of a graph and visual heavy presentation. I'm not going to just load black text on the screen for an hour. You'll be happy to see I'm going to talk over it all. We'll go through a little bit of the background, first of all, as to who took part and some of that interesting stuff, so you can see if it relates to you. Spoiler alert, it does. Various trends and insights there. The thing that a lot of you are really going to be here for, which is success rates, and really how we've dug into those, how to use it, is it useful, and how is it useful? And then some final thoughts on activity of workload, challenges, as well as AI, which is some really interesting points there, which included a very recent change which has come out, which might be of interest to a lot of you. So first of all, just a bit of a profile about the different causes that were surveyed. There are actually, as I said, about 155 people took part from over 25 different types of causes, as it turned out. And these are just the sort of the top most common ones, if you will. Those top 4 or 5 there will come up later as well, with some specific analysis that we're able to look at because we had that higher sample size. So if you're in any of these sort of organizations, there might be some specifically interesting take homes for you there. And the bottom figures there are the income of the charities that took part as well. So as you can see, they're quite a representative range of the wider sector, which is fantastic. That's exactly what we want to see. One of the first things we looked at, again, just asking these sort of background questions, is that, the number of years that your charity has had a trust program for. Really important that we ask this, because we just wanted to account for, differences in, the existence of a historic trust program is really important, because of course, anyone who's ever done this, as I have previously, if you're starting off a trust program from scratch, probably at a smaller charity, you're going to spend a disproportionately large amount of time not on writing, but on building that first pipeline, on setting up those internal processes for information gathering, and many other challenges that comes with. So this gives you sort of a good range here, but actually around like over 80% of the people that were surveyed had their charity had a trust program for at least 3 years. So again, that's broadly representative of a lot of the sort of the sector who would take part in trust fundraising, which is good. Again, we also asked how many days you work as a trust fundraiser per week. And that was really important that we asked that because some people would have been, full 5 days a week trust fundraisers. Some may be a part-time trust fundraiser. Some may be a fundraising manager wearing many hats, and things like that. And where possible, we looked at if these affect the different outcomes. So obviously, if you're working 5 days a week compared to 1 day a week, you might expect that you're sending more applications. And we account for all these variables where we could and where it was relevant to do so, to spot any anomalies in the data and things like that. So we'll go through that. So starting off here, I think that this is actually one of arguably the most interesting things that we can talk about here. So we asked, what was the lowest value grant you applied to in the last 12 months? And just for context, this report was around a 12-month period up to around December just gone, to give you the context. So we're looking at realistically all of 2024 for this sort of data. And as you can see here, 84% of people that took part said that their lowest value grants they applied to were up to around the 5K mark. And this figure really didn't change that much based on cause type or the size of charity. So where if you've got a really, really large charity, many of them were still applying for this up to 5K as well as the smaller charities. And I think this is really important to see, because actually that says 97% of the fundraisers that took part in this they were applying for grants of up to 10K as their lowest value. And given that this is representative of charities of all sizes and type, it's really clear that funders with grant schemes, especially with those that are capped at around 5K, they're facing a really disproportionately high volume of applications from just across the sector. Which is, as you can see, we're all talking about higher competition, the challenges of funders, stopping probably more often than not to relook at their strategies to how they're going to challenge this. I think this tells us quite an interesting state of where things are alone. Conversely, we asked what are the highest value grants that people applied to in the last 12 months. And actually, this was a much broader range, but you can see where these are kind of focused from that sort of 50 to 500K range here, which is a better representation, you would think. And if we'll go into later about the different types of causes and the different total income raised and things like that, so you can sort of see where you sit in the grand scheme of things here. I think the question here is whether trust fundraisers should, in fact, plan for a more diverse pipeline of grant sizes in order to mitigate that increasing competition that we're facing in the sector. This is an interesting food for thought as we go through the rest of the presentation. So, of course, we also asked how much have you raised from trusts and foundations in the last 12 months? And again, I think a lot of you here will find this really interesting to sort of see and to benchmark yourself against. But I just want to caveat that by saying that there are, of course, massive factors involved in this. It's not just about we need to raise as much money always, regardless of what cause and type. If you're there as a capital trust fundraiser needing to raise 250K, you don't need to raise that 500K. And arguably the other way around. So, and it's just all different types. And of course, if you're solely there to try and raise core costs, you're nowhere near going to be able to raise as easily, say, £3 million in core costs than someone with a big, capital campaign as well. We all know this, but it's just really important to see that variances there are really quite sort of around this, again, that 50 to 500K range. Most was around about 250 to 300K is where sort of the most common amount raised from trusts and foundations was in the last 12 months. So again, hopefully that raised a really interesting benchmark. Now, something that I wanted to raise here, which, as I said at the beginning, we looked at some of the most common types of causes that took part as well. And because we had that high sample size to make this valid, I wanted to look at how these different types of causes and the income that they've raised from trusts and foundations compares to the total average. And so two particular take homes here to me is particularly with health. You can see that health charities were able to raise, much more at the higher end compared to the lower end, compared to the average. And similarly with disability as well, it's just sort of down another notch there. Interestingly, arts and culture either was much higher at the 50 to 100K or the 1 to 2 million. And this was largely attributed to actually the size of the charity. So I think it's quite interesting to look at and again benchmark to see for example, if you're a disability charity and you've got a goal of, £3 million, you might say, well, actually, most disability charities are raising around these areas compared to the average. So again, these things can just really help as you're looking to do new strategies, new insights, or you're getting internal pressure requests, and so on and so forth. So going on to trends. So this has been really interesting because I think there's a lot of doom and gloom of high competition. What do we do? Where is the sector going? And rightfully so. And interestingly, when we asked the fundraisers that took part, do you forecast your income to grow, stay the same, or decrease? Most fundraisers, which was 58%, expected their income to either grow or stay the same in 2025. And in fact, slightly more fundraisers expected their income to grow than those that expected it to decrease. Now, the caveat to that, as you can see here, there's more fundraisers said that they expect their income to decrease substantially compared to those that expected to increase substantially. But as a whole, if we were to take this as an accurate representation of where the sector is going in 2025 onwards, we could say that we could expect there to be less volatility or even grounds for more cautious optimism ahead, which is something that may be surprising, but good to see for a lot of you here watching. So again, all of this and the visuals will be in the final report to dive through as well. Now, a big talking point in the trust sector is, the number of trusts and foundations that seem to be no longer accepting unsolicited applications. It's a big challenge. Funders changing their minds more than often seems to be a thing, but no one that I've seen in sort of recent years had really asked that question to find out, is that true or is it a perception? So, first of all, nearly 80% of fundraiser surveys said, yes, I'm absolutely finding that more funders than ever are no longer accepting unsolicited applications. So what we did then is that we then asked these fundraisers that had secured income or meetings or conversations with these funders who weren't accepting unsolicited requests, how they did it, to provide a bit more of some insight there. And it was really interesting. So these are the different sort of categories that were laid out to do that. This was done thematically. And here we can see the importance of connections and networking in impacting 52% of all of that success. I think since that says that we found 19% found funders actually reach out to them directly as well, which also has really emphasized the need for charities to be visible to funders, whether online or in person, or at events such as conferences, which is arguably more important now as funders are going to continue to seek new ways to reduce the time it takes them to find and process applications. And of course, as they can do a Google search of the top X type of charity, and you're at the top of that, you are absolutely going to be one of the first people that they at least get in touch with, and you want to be visible. And when we go on later or shortly after this to look at the importance of repeat funding applications versus cold, we'll see just how important that is. It's quite interesting, actually, when I put this together. I'm trying to do a little bit of work just for a little music festival charity that I volunteer for, trying to find some rather urgent grant funding for them. They have no contacts. I've never really done fundraising before. So I sent a quick email to a contact I know who's a senior staff member at a different festival charity, because I found that one of their trustees happened to also be the trustee of a funder with no website, no information, but looking through their accounts, I knew that they funded music work. So I popped this staff member a quick email just saying, appreciate this is out of the blue, feel free to say no. Any chance I could be introduced to your trustee? Just I'm trying to have get a conversation going. And she literally replied within the hour and said, of course, Connor, don't ask, don't get. I'd love to help. I'm actually meeting them later on this evening for a board meeting. Leave it with me. I've had a promising response within the day. So it's just I can't see anyone on the screen, but Chris, I don't know if you had any interesting examples to talk about there as well. I just thought it was really interesting talking point.
It is, and it's been a challenge for many, many years. It has got worse, as you demonstrated already, Connor, in the previous slide. I think, we have to be careful, don't we? And it's understandable that we're slightly cautious because we don't want to cause anyone to take against us because we may have done something which they don't approve of. But that shouldn't stop us. I think it's interesting that people have reached out anyway, and just said to hell with it. We've got to crack on. We've got to try and find out. It would be interesting equally to know what sort of response they got to that. But the fact is that they have secured meetings. That's positive. But I do think that personal connection in whatever way, shape, or form. So thinking as broadly as you possibly can about who you might know, how you might access somebody, because you may not know one of the trustees, but as your case just proves, there are trustees who others may know that you know. So it's that perpetual circle that is very important to us in all fundraising elements, which is, do we know people that can have influence for us and make introductions? I think in terms of more relevant, we're working, kind of you and I, as you know, with a large client at the moment, and there was an historical reason to go back to a number of very large funders. We gave us the excuse, so they wouldn't be offended by us asking. We equally weren't going to be offended if they turned around and said, look, it's not of interest to us. And as a result, we're two or three meetings down the progress. Now, it doesn't mean necessarily that we're going to get support from them, but at least we're making some headway. And that's the positive part of all of this. So I do think you need to think creatively. You have to be a little bit bold at times, but equally, you've got to be diplomatic. You've got to put it out there that you would love a chat, but you fully understand if that isn't possible, that's not possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what we go on to next is success rates. I just wanted to note I can't see the chat or anyone's faces, but I've noticed some sort of hands going up as Zoom does. So if you do have any questions, please please try and put them in the chat, and we're going to answer questions at the end, and we'll go through the chat first before we just generally open it up. It's going to be a little bit more text heavy, but arguably that's what you want for this kind of thing. So what we looked at was not just average success rates, which is what we've done before, and I'll explain in a second what that is and actually why we do not recommend using that. But we asked fundraisers to break down the new and cold applications sent and how many were successful, as well as the same for repeat applications. And it's very, very clear, but perhaps unsurprising, to see that the much lower success rate of new and cold applications and the amount raised on average compared to repeat, that 24% compared to 63% there, despite the obvious differences in how the makeup of the pipeline. Now, when we averaged everything up, the average success rate for trust applications was just over 35%. The average value of pipelines was £1 million, ranging from £5,000 to £7 million. And the average number of applications sent was 52. Now, I just want to say a few things about this, first of all, before we go on to something really interesting. It's worth noting that, of course, that you could always see that there may be a slight bias towards more quote unquote successful fundraisers taking part in the survey. But we discovered that the vast differences in success rates from variables such as whether they were cold or repeat actually means that this average success rate is something that we really wouldn't recommend using, especially not internally and to board members for strategies. What is much more important is to be able to look at much more nuanced things. So yes, that cold and repeat, but also your cause type. So if we go on here, again, as we looked at some of the most common types of charities that took part, there's three big take homes here. So actually disability charities, they had a 75% success rate on average with repeat funders, and actually the lowest cold success rate. So completely one end of the extreme to the other. And actually this was quite there wasn't a large levels of variance on this as well. So it's quite interesting. Arts and culture, interesting, as this is something especially around sort of community aspects of funding seems to be growing. Had just over a third success rate for cold applications, and whether that is representative of the sort of how people are wanting to fund things more at that sort of local arts, culture, and like community level or not, obviously requires more digging. There are big differences in the sizes of arts and culture organizations, but these were separate to heritage because we outlined them as two different types of causes there as well, which is worth knowing. Now, really interestingly, heritage organizations, which leads on to our next point, had a 50% average success rate as well as the lowest number of applications sent. And me and Chris were just talking about this before. I think there's two reasons for that. The first one is that historically, heritage organizations, they have a lot fewer funding options to go to in terms of trusts with a particular interest in funding heritage works than health, for example. But also sending less applications can mean that you can possibly spend more time writing a much stronger application, which you would hope with the facts of quality over quantity, you would have a higher success rate, and that's also what's happened here. So, for those of you that read our last year's report, we found something really interesting, which was a clear sort of cutoff point from once you start sending over a certain number of applications, your success rate diminishes quite significantly. So we, of course, looked at that again this time and found, again, that to be absolutely the case. So this top green bar represents repeat success rates. And if you see along the x-axis here, this is the range of applications sent. So for up to about 10 to 25 applications sent, as an 84% success rate for repeat funding and 39% success rate for cold. Now, in the raw data itself, it was when it got to around sort of 30 to 40 applications is when we saw a really stark drop off in that total success rate. And actually, if we obviously all applications are different sizes, but if we looked at a few different ways of doing this for say £5,000 grants sort of in and around that, and it turned out that actually you would end up raising pretty much exactly the same if you sent 25 applications compared to sending 50 based on the success rates of cold, the cold success rate, for example. And what that tells us, if we were again to take this as representative of the wider sector, which I think is really, really important, is that doing more applications doesn't actually necessarily mean that you're going to raise more income. In fact, it can be a detriment to growth because, is your quality going to diminish and you're going to maybe potentially drop the ball in other things like admin, which is really important for repeat funding, by burning yourself out and doing too many applications? Or, if you restrict your pipeline down to, maybe a much stronger, much more eligible, relevant pipeline, and you're able to spend more time writing a much, higher quality application, you would obviously hope that your success rate for that is going to be stronger. And that is what we tend to see here. Now, I'm not saying everybody should suddenly go from sending 100 applications to 25. There's so many more factors involved in this. But the point that we wanted to raise here is that when we're looking at benchmarking trusts, success rates and income raise and what to do for your next sort of, the strategies over the next coming years, take a very nuanced approach to this and don't just think, okay, well, we sent 30 applications last year. Well, we know there's a lot more funders out there for us. Let's send 60 with the same resource. You can, obviously loads of reasons why we shouldn't do that. Burnout among the most obvious ones, challenges with recruitment and so on. But the data here, as it did in our last survey that we did, very much tells us that that could actually be a detriment to growth, particularly with cold. And really, I've gone past that. So if anyone's got any particular questions around those as well, we can dig into the data a lot more. We can answer those questions at the end. There's a lot more information around this in the written report as well. I'm just conscious of time. But what I wanted to also say on that is that when we looked at all of the data, there was actually also a very high correlation of a 0.9 for repeat applications sent compared to how many were successful, which statistically tells us there's much higher reliability in forecasting income from warm sources effectively. This was not the case with cold applications, and that's really, really important to know. In fact, it's an interesting sort of tidbit here. For those of you who are aware of the Barrett Foundation, they quite recently cited that 45% of applicants to one of their 300 grand grant funds were actually not eligible, and as a result of that, they've completely changed their strategy. And I believe that this is much less likely to do with quote unquote poor fundraising, and actually more to do with the result of pressure to grow internally, to overcome these hurdles of high competition, and potentially, we're just sending applications which could have ideally used a bit more time on, or restricting that pipeline down a bit more. And we'll talk about some of these factors more down at the end as well. I also just wanted to highlight something really interesting as well. That's why I missed a graph here. If we go back, it's very similar, but I wanted to break down the success rates based on the number of those sent. So rather than the total number sent, just say, for example, this is just the number of 25 to 50 cold applications sent. However, when we looked at this sudden jump was a result of there only being very few people that took part at this level. And actually, when we then look back at it, it's not really that good of a metric to look at, because it's far more important to look at the overall workload that you're facing as an individual fundraiser, and how that impacts success. So for those of you interested, this is what I would really look at, and then also comparing this to what type of cause you're on, what type of, the type of project that you've got as well. These are far more important considerations to make when you're trying to benchmark yourself. So if we were to move on to time spent on activity, we asked fundraisers how much time they spent on the different activities. We also asked if this should change since compared to the previous year, and actually there was no difference on average whatsoever, not even by 1% really, for any of these factors compared to last year. This is obviously much more a harder thing to guesstimate, but it was interesting that there wasn't a great deal of variance. I will talk about something particularly interesting in a moment. What is interesting here is that when we looked at all these different variables, there was no significant change compared to last year, but there was a moderate correlation between the time spent on admin versus the success and income raised from repeat applications, which, for those of you who often do these sort of repeat funding applications and you're establishing those relationships, you have to do a lot more you would maybe describe that as more admin work than you would be just research and writing for cold new applications, which is really interesting. Now, conversely, the income raised from repeat funders was actually negatively correlated with the total time spent on research and writing. So again, perhaps it's the case that the more opportunities you have to write repeat funding applications with warmer funders, it is better to make sure that you're saying, look, we're not going to research any more on our pipeline, and we're going to probably spend less time writing, because we're going to spend more time proportionately nurturing those relationships and giving those existing and warmer funders to us what they need to be happy to continue funding us. And that's a really, really important consideration. Trust fundraising isn't just research some trusts out there. When are the deadlines open? Write it, send it, tell me if it wins, which some people do who aren't in the sector. It is relationship building, as with all fundraising, and that is so important, and it's often missed in this sector. So hopefully this should provide some more quantitative insight to senior managers and board members who might be looking to increase income simply through submitting, just more applications. Again, as we said, it's a lot more nuanced than that, and statistically, we're showing that doesn't even necessarily increase growth. It can actually be a detriment to it. So moving on to the use of AI. So we asked everyone that took part, do you use any AI tools? And of course, how do you rate the impact of that? And there's some really interesting things come through here. And I was surprised to see that almost half of everyone surveyed are actually not currently using AI tools for their work at all. So what we did then was, for those that did, we asked to break that down into lots of different ways, or the main ways that people are using AI tools like ChatGPT. And you can sort of see on this screen here, and I'll summarize some of the key findings there. 57% of fundraisers said that choosing AI to help compile information was actually the most useful. And half of those that use AI also said it was valuable for converting previous applications into smaller word counts. Now, given that on that previous graph that 38% of your time is spent on writing on average, this clearly presents a potential opportunity to increase efficiency. Something I think is more interesting than that is worth noting that 40% of fundraisers found AI most useful for providing more prospect research, but 46% found it least useful for better quality prospect research. And why I find that interesting is I believe that there has been a clear learning gap in our sector so far that's not quite caught up with us, and how to use these tools in the best way. And until even just as recently as the last week, ChatGPT, for example, which is the one we'll mostly be familiar with, isn't set up to sort of mine the internet in real time for information. So if you're trying to ask it for what is the latest sort of funding priorities and deadlines for this funder, it's not going to do it. And actually, sometimes it will give you fictional results on purpose. So clearly, we need to tread very lightly when using AI tools for prospecting. However, we fully expect the statistic to rapidly change over the next couple of years. So new tools are out now, literally just come out pretty much in the last week, such as ChatGPT's Deep Research and Google Gemini's research tool, also called Deep Research, which launched a few months ago. What they do is they use the same processes that a skilled human researcher would use when conducting complex, lengthy research online, and they can do it in rapid time. So whilst these advances will inevitably make it easier to use AI to gather quality prospect research in real time, especially compared to now or a week ago, there's also, the risk for that learning gap in our sector to widen. So I would expect that over the next couple of years, it would actually be commonplace to see training sessions and conference talks focused on how can trust fundraisers best use the latest AI tools to conduct high quality prospect research. And as we've seen based on workload activity and things like that before, if you had a magic wand that could do that for you, keep you updated with which funders are no longer eligible and any new ones that pop up which suddenly are, if you can spend a lot less time on that research, then you can maybe spend more time on writing quality applications, of course, as well as nurturing those longer term relationships with hopefully repeat funders, which is really important. And that is, I believe, going to really help overcome the issues of funders changing their priorities more frequently, but of course just generally enabling us to reduce burnout and focus on what's most important. So it's also interesting, some of you may have seen, I believe it was a few weeks ago, that the National Lottery also provided guidance, is out on their website now, on the use of AI within its own funding applications, where they didn't say don't use it. They said, we fully expect everyone to be using this. This is our sort of guidance and what we would expect. So bottom line is that we believe those who are not upskilled over, especially if we're talking 5 years time in this, are going to fall behind other fundraisers. Of course, how and if you use AI tools from an environmental perspective and all these other things is a decision to make at your individual charity level. We can't talk to that for you, of course. So lots mentioned about AI there. We're nearing the end of the presentation as we go through where we asked what are the biggest challenges in the trust and foundation sector today, which is really interesting. So most funders believe that the greatest challenges are higher competition, probably unsurprisingly, and funders changing their priorities to themes which are no longer eligible to them and doing that more often as well. Again, something that I'm sure that we've all felt, but may not necessarily have known, A, if that's true, and B, if others are feeling the same, or if it's just my potluck, for example. So hopefully that gives a bit of a reassurance in some ways and to see where the overall sector is at. I think the focus here is in having a larger pipeline, if you can, which then has the flexibility to shrink down to what is that optimal number of applications where you can really maximize those success rates. So, for example, if you're fortunate enough to have, 100 eligible applications to send, most of them cold, for example, that gives you a lot more flexibility to mitigate higher competition by, looking at those success rate metrics based on your course type and all these other things that we've shown so far and say, is it better for me to reduce that 100 pipeline down to the strongest top 50 from that and spend a lot longer nurturing those and writing the most sort of relevant application to each of those to increase a total income and total success rates. And I think that is a really key indicator of how we can challenge this problem of high competition, especially when we're looking at grants up to around £5,000, where we've seen just how disproportionate it is with the number of applications sent to those sort of funders. So of course, we asked, have you observed a shrinking portfolio of prospects in the last 12 months compared to previous years? And again, perhaps unsurprisingly, 70% of fundraisers said yes, I've definitely observed that, which again, is something that a lot of people talk about in our sector and over sort of the last year or so, but there hasn't really been a great deal of insight into, is it just me? And how does that compare? And this was also, it's worth knowing, largely the same across every type of cause. There wasn't really any significant differences between that as well. So we can see that it's pretty much like representative of the wider funding sector rather than just particular types of causes, which I think is really interesting. So obviously, not only have we shown here that, improving success rates can be done by shrinking potentially our own pipeline. I think there's just a really interesting case to make here that if we can actually challenge this high competition and a shrinking portfolio of prospects, and actually we could possibly turn it into a positive by thinking, well, okay, if we know that we've got a shrinking portfolio of prospects, rather than be stung by that, and then we've got our pipeline, and then all of a sudden all these ones are no longer eligible, and all these other things that we've talked about, maybe we actively choose to have a much tighter, potentially smaller compared to previous years, pipeline. If we do that, if we plan to do that, then we're not going to be spending a disproportionate amount of time on research, but only for a large amount of those to no longer be eligible, for example, so time wasted. If we plan to have a much more concise pipeline from the beginning, we can then plan to have much more time spent on those applications and on that relationship building. And I believe as much as we have the power to change anything across the wider sector, I believe that's something that we all do have control over, which is really, really important and should actually feel quite empowering, I would hope. Now, this is our last slide. So again, all this detail this is a lot more detail in the report, which is on our website, which we'll link to in a second. We try to go through this as quick as possible because there's a lot to get through. But the last thing we asked was, what would make the biggest difference in your ability to raise more income? And this was an open question, and so these 6 were compiled thematically. And again, this should hopefully provide a bit of reassurance to those of you who are maybe finding some of these challenges yourselves, both internally and externally, to know that it may not just be you. This is a wider sector challenge, and you can actually use this insight potentially, for your cases to make internally. So things here about clarity and communication. Yes, there's a desire for funders to be more open and transparent regarding their eligibility and their funding criteria to make sure that you're not just getting instant no's after spending a day of work on an application. Really, really important. There were a lot of calls for the need for there to be a lot more unrestricted support for core funding. Application processes and competition. There is actually an emphasis that people gave on wanting more relationship-driven methods. But of course, there's higher competition. But then it's also frustrating when, we see that funders are no longer accepting unsolicited applications. So there's kind of a dichotomy here between actively wanting more relationship-driven funding relationships, and it's really who's in charge of that. But I think if we listen back to that graph from earlier, which showed how people are succeeding in approaching no unsolicited application funders, it it still works, and there's many methods that you're able to use to employ to do that. So it's a good way of challenging that. Organizational capacity, internal readiness. I was surprised actually there was not many fundraisers felt that this was one of the greatest challenges, but many fundraisers that took part instead did say that they felt that they were actually limited by staff capacity and organizational buy-in. So again, it's that internal is really important factor compared to external influences as well. Eligibility constraints, as we talked about, this will always naturally be a challenge if you're particularly charities who have just ticked over into that 1 million turnover period. You might suddenly realize that you've got loads of funders that you can no longer apply to, and again, a really big way of being able to overcome that would simply be to be spending that time more so nurturing these relationships with funders, because you will probably be surprised how often that won't just be a straight no. If you've got an existing relationship with a funder, they want to see you continue to succeed. That's why they fund you. So if you're maybe looking at in over the next couple of years, maybe tipping over into that 1 million, and that you're gonna be restricted by the number of applications you can send, maybe now is the time to focus a lot more time on developing those relationships to make sure that you can continue to be eligible. Which is great. And on that last thing there, innovation and future needs. So, there was lots of suggestions actually about having shared portals and just like different sort of funding strategies in place, which will always be a topic for consideration. So take home thoughts. There's a lot of information there. As I said, this is all in the final report, which is on our website. I hope you found that useful, but for some sort of our 5 take home thoughts here. And bearing in mind that when we do this survey, I really go into it with a completely open mind. And if there is nothing that comes out that's reliable or significant to talk about, I wouldn't have done the webinar. It's not worth just actively guessing. We do we look with a completely open mind to see what is the data telling us. And the data is telling us these 5 top things here. Repeat applications, significantly higher success rate compared to cold, and it's much more reliable as well. The income rate from that is also higher. Perhaps unsurprising, but the scale of that, I think, is really powerful to see. And again, this was the case with all different types and sizes of charities, which should be quite encouraging. Average success rates, as we said, I would unrecommend using the average success rates here as a benchmarking tool, because we can see there are dramatic changes to that success rate based on just a few simple variables, such as your course type, your activity and workload, whether it's cold or warm. It continues to be the case, of course, that simply submitting more applications does not necessarily increase income. In fact, it can be a detriment to growth, and funding applications at that £5,000 mark especially are facing much higher competition for funding from all different types and sizes of charities. And I think there is a case really to make, which is something that we don't often talk about as fundraisers, which is how much of that higher competition is actually something that we as fundraisers can help reduce. And, of course, if everyone just suddenly started sending applications left, right, and center, that's actually going to make that problem from funders worse, and it's going to close more funding opportunities while they review their strategies and how to cope. And actually, it could be the case that if all of us collectively decided to shrink maybe our portfolio, if we could, down a little bit and have much stronger relationships and much more clearly eligible and relevant applications going out, then that quote unquote burden that funders are facing on the sheer numbers that they're getting of applications every year would go down, and therefore that we can actually collectively will help each other. And I see the direction going over the few years, hopefully, is that we will have a lot more of a funders and fundraisers and the organizations that well, both of them will actually work closer together on how to tackle these challenges. In fact, we're actually discussing current at the moment as Gifted potentially doing a webinar with one of the leading funders in the country, which would be really interesting to get those insights on as well. And lastly, clearly there is high competition. Clearly there is a shrinking portfolio of pipelines out there. But as we've seen from different variables, there's actually room for cautious optimism ahead for growth. And of course, advancements in AI tools enabling actually high quality research for the first time to do this could actually be a method that we can help mitigate this by enabling us to spend more time on the things that matter most. As I said, writing the best quality applications that we can and spending that time nurturing relationships with funders. So that was just over 45 minutes. I'm conscious that I can't see anything in the chat, but Chris, I'll take it away and just wanted to again thank you.
Yeah. Firstly, Konna, thank you ever so much. It's a really great piece of work, and we've got one comment on the end here on the questions saying how fascinating, helpful, and validating it was, and one of the few webinars that had held this particular lady's attention from start to finish. So well done, Konna.
Take that.
I hope others feel the same way. So we've got a few questions, and I apologise if people try to enter on chat. For some reason, that seems to be disabled, but we've got questions here. So I'm not necessarily going to go through them in order, but let's just clarify a few things. One lady arrived late. Can you just repeat how many people took part in the survey?
155.
155. So hopefully that tidies that one up. And just so that everybody's on the same page, can you explain your definition of pipeline as used in the presentation?
Yeah, so I just use Excel for this typically, but it is your list of eligible funders that you aim to send an application to. So that would be my definition of a pipeline. I would never include funders that I've researched and then I know that they're no longer eligible in that because I just wouldn't bother.
Absolutely. So it's a dynamic process. As and when you've got a definitive answer, you'll either move forward or take them off.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go back if we would. An early question related to the average number, related to the number 52, and the question is 52 the average number of applications sent by a charity in a year, or the number of successful applications? And that was an early slide. I don't know if you want to flick back.
Yeah, no, I remember because I've been so head in this data, it's kept me up at night. That was the average number of applications sent in that 12-month period from when the fundraiser took part in the survey. So which was either between October or to December 2024. So
roughly speaking, one a week, although we all know it's not done on that basis, but that's
yes. So that was the grand average number of applications sent. Now that was different for cold and warm. If I recall, the average number of sort of repeat applications sent was 15, and the average number of cold was around 33. The difference is there is because there's a lot of variances as we look at the whole data.
If you could just flick back very quickly to the biggest challenges slide. So I don't know how long that will take you.
This one?
That one. Yeah. So the two keys, color keys, can you just remind us all what they are?
Sorry, that's entirely my fault. That's been put across wrong. So the green, so the top one is what fundraisers said was the least, like the least greatest challenge, so to speak. And then that blue bar, I've clearly put this wrong graph in, but the data's correct, is what they thought the greatest challenge was there. So we can clearly see that the greatest challenge here, higher competition and funders changing priorities to themes that are no longer make them eligible. Actually, the least challenge was the need to research prospects more often, which was quite interesting.
Okay. Thank you for clearing those up. Right, a few more questions. I'm going to start at the top. So, did the income forecast question specify whether forecasts were based on real expectations or on needs, budgets, demands of organisations, uninformed trustees? I have a lot of sympathy for that. I suspect it's a bit of everything, but what was your interpretation, Konna?
So I mean, this was like exactly as it's quoted, the question that was asked. So do you forecast your income to grow, stay the same, or decrease next year? There's obviously lots of variables within that as to why, and if so, you could forecast something today with an expectation that you might actually have like a low, medium, high expectation when you're doing your budgets. Um, I've the point for not doing that was because we didn't really want to put people off. There was a lot of information to get through in this survey alone, and it's really difficult getting participants for this kind of survey. But this you can see this is like an overall picture of, do you see your income realistically to grow, stay the same, or decrease next year from Trust and Foundations, to be clear? So hopefully that answers that question there. I don't know if you've got any other thoughts on that,
No,
Chris.
I was just going to say that there's always going to be a degree of wishful thinking, isn't there, from trustees and boards and chief executives and everybody else. I think what I gleaned from this is the views. These are very much the views of the trust fundraisers, and hopefully they are their own views rather than being influenced too much by other people.
Yeah, absolutely. And and to be clear, like, this survey was done by fundraisers completing these questions. You would hope that somebody wasn't opening the survey and then they had the chair of trustees behind them looking at what they're doing. I highly doubt that would be the case. So.
Thank you. Right. Another question. So the success rate against the number of applications was this person says is a very interesting slide. Did we do any further analysis on the amounts raised against number of applications sent?
Yes, I did. And the reason it's not in here, except for obviously on here with like sort of the average amount raised based on whether it was cold or repeat. The reason I didn't do it about the amount raised by numbers of applications is because at that point, it once you add in the other variable of the size of your charity, because as we all know, if you're a £5 million organization, you're far more likely to have a much bigger need for trust income than if you're a £200,000 income charity. Once we factored in that variable, I just wasn't confident to talk about it enough with the sample size that we had to pull out anything significant. So as I said at the end of the presentation, if I wasn't confident that it would be significantly relevant to put in here from the data, I didn't want to put it in.
I mean, I'll just add something there just from my own personal experience, and I've obviously been in this business a very long time. My suspicion is that to get a larger amount of income, a larger grant, probably demands more information, probably is going to result from a more focused, detailed approach, concentrating on a smaller number of applications, but very good ones, as you said before, rather than sort of blanket applications going across a number of different funders. So I'd imagine the one balances out the other a little bit, that actually, very often the less applications you make, it may just be that part of the reasons for that is that they're for higher value and therefore you spend more time, you're more focused. And that's certainly in the heritage statistic would seem to back that up. Great success rate, but actually a relatively low number of applications. That is partially, as you say, because there are less heritage funders out there, but where they do exist, they are very particular about what information they require and they demand quite a lot. But in return, the rewards are greater. So I think the two is sort of balancing act.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually just wanted to note that as well. You just reminded me, so one tiny thing that I forgot to say. For when we're looking at other variables affecting success rates as well. That there was also one other sort of standout finding, which I found based on a different type of charity where it was very significant and it was quite clear. Was that for charities with turnover of between sort of 300K to 1 million in size, spending 20 to 30% of time on research resulted in a 44% success rate on average. Sorry, not on average, 44% success rate and 105K income from cold funders versus a 20% success rate and 55K income for those spending less than 20% of time on research or too much. So effectively, what we saw then was for charities of that size, and there should be loads of reasons behind this, is that there was a very dramatic difference of actually halving success rates and halving income effectively based on how much time was spent in research. And that also said that there was clearly an optimal range for workload as well. And again, it's just interesting to think about how many other variables are at stake, which goes back to saying we really don't recommend using one average benchmark figure for success rates.
Now we've started questions. There are lots coming in, and we've only got a very small amount of time to deal with them. So forgive me, anybody who's put a question in. If we haven't answered it here, we will keep the questions, and we will try to answer them. Or email us directly. Email Konna at Gifted to ask a specific question, but I'm just going to touch on a couple. Um, Somebody asked whether it's worth us putting out the data separately for charities under 1 million. It probably is, but we haven't got it at this moment in time. But that is something we may well work on in the future. Uh, about the ethics of using AI, it's a very good point somebody's made that one particular foundation has recently said that they've seen lots of similarities in language, and therefore some organizations naturally are cautious about using it. I think, how do you think fundraisers can use AI ethically? Personally, and I'm a bit of an old dinosaur, I think they're great for the research element of it, but I would prefer to see my own words on an application. I think they're useful to be able to craft them, get some of the grammar right, get it a bit more concise. But in reality, I think the best applications come from your own mind rather than artificial one. That's a personal view. Conrad, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's I personally do not use AI tools for writing at all. I don't like it. I don't think it's the right way. And also, similar to the findings in this, I always make sure that I have a tighter pipeline so that I can spend that more time on really pulling out the nuances of the specifics that funder is interested in, so I can talk about it that way. By the time you put that information in for an AI to write it, you then spend half the time editing it. I don't find it worth it. What I will say about the ethics of using AI, not only ethics more broadly from a societal perspective, but also the environmental concerns, is that I think, as I said earlier, that is a discussion that I believe should be happening more at board level, and it's up to individual charities to decide what to do. Similarly, to have every charity should have an environmental policy. I don't care if you're not an environmental charity. That's something that we all are impacted by, and we should all have those sort of discussions. It is, however, very, very difficult to know where you should stand on this topic when the advances in AI are increasing so much more rapidly than everyone can keep up. By the time we've debated something, that's why we really don't have any regulations even in place at the moment from a government perspective. So it could be up to us and funders, I believe, to work more closely together to say this is, what we all now collectively believe is the way that we should be using this ethically. But I don't think we're there yet.
Right.
But I do think yeah.
We need to wrap this up. So a couple of quick questions. Bridget, glad you agree with me. So two dinosaurs together at least in the rooms. I'll acknowledge that one. Animal welfare. Do we? It's the question is that animal welfare is often shut out of a lot of the bigger trusts and foundations. Do we have any data for that?
Not to hand is the short answer, unfortunately.
Well,
And
apologies that we don't have that, but we will something we will maybe address next time. We are working with and have worked with a couple of animal welfare charities, so we've been through that experience, and we do know it's a challenge. Another one about causes: is it getting easier to raise funding for causes which are working on systems change? Are fundraisers still having problems covering indirect costs? My gut feeling is yes, they are. Anything in the research that back that up?
not in this data, no. Again, it's a very nuanced approach. And actually, in our qualitative questions that we asked, where people were discussing the challenges and other type things, it didn't really come up that much. So, we can only speak to the data in this report so far.
Okay, thank you. In terms of repeat applications, can you just clarify what you mean? I think you mean applications that follow a previous successful application rather than another application that follows an unsuccessful one, if you know what I mean.
Yes, and I believe if I'm remembering exactly how I quoted this in the survey itself, it was if you've received, or sent an application to a funder who you have received funding from at least within the last 2 to 3 years, to account for the fact that they may have not given in the last 2 years because it may have been a multi-year gift, and I don't want to sort of confuse anyone that way. So,
Brilliant.
yeah.
Thank you. Very quickly then, when you talked about the average number, was that for full-time grants fundraisers? Or can you remember that? Was just per charity?
The average. So, well, in
Number
terms
of
of
applications.
yeah, the average number of applications, that was just sort of that was done on average. When I actually tried to sort of correlate it based on, say, if somebody worked 2 days a week compared to 5, surprisingly the number didn't change that significantly, to the point that it wasn't. I can do this if you're interested in emailing me and giving you sort of the breakdown of all of that. Say, everyone that said 2 days a week, this is how many on average. But it wasn't here. I can't remember the stats off the top of my head, unfortunately. But I do remember the total average actually surprisingly not changing too much, which is probably because of, generalist fundraising managers that they're doing other stuff. If you're working 5 days a week at higher size charities, you're also probably maybe spending 3 days on trusts, for example. So probably all averaged out.
Okay. Look, it's now 3 o'clock, so we're going to draw this to a close. But thank you ever so much, everybody. My apologies again to the few people whose questions haven't been answered. But do feel free to send us an email if you want the answer, and Connor will reply as soon as he possibly can. Can I thank you all for coming? A reminder, the recording will be on the website next week, and the report that Connor's referred to is already there. Do please feel free to contact us with any more questions, and we'll do our best to answer them. But have a great rest of the day, great rest of the week, and best of luck to you all for your fundraising in the year ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much for listening to a very data heavy session.
Well done, Connor. Thanks, everybody. Bye now.
You all.